for me, the first act has been to fundamentally shift our thinking. And my hope is that shifting the consciousness of how we enter in this work will then reveal to us how we can do the work on our terms in a way that makes us feel good. Not eliminates the hardness of it, because to serve is a difficult thing, but to bring back the joy that should also accompany the hard work that's involved. There's so many of us that are operating in this space with no joy. And how can that be when so many of us, when we did our State of Black Nonprofits report and we asked the question, why do you do this? An overwhelming majority of folks pointed to a compulsion, a sense of duty, a calling from something higher and above. How can something that is spiritual, that is guided by spirit, have you feeling so terrible about yourself and about your circumstance and your community? Something there is amiss. There is something that is wrong that needs to be shifted. We have to make the work feel good so that we can keep doing it, because the community needs us. We need each other, and we can't continue to do it from this place of exhaustion. Doing things in service to each other, for each other, in relationship with one another cannot leave us depleted. That is life-affirming work, but yet this is how we feel when we do it. Something is broken and wrong. And it's not what we're doing. I think it's the way in which we think about what we're doing, or the way that we've been trained to think about what we're doing. And part of the sort of philosophical shift and consciousness shift is actually, acknowledging our own self-worth in this space, because nobody can match our level of commitment and creativity and innovation in our insistence on supporting community. Nobody can match that. And that kind of internalized sense of worth, when it actually is internalized, will be a dramatic shift for all of us. I just know that the work will look different. It will feel different. It won't be any less hard, but how we feel about it and how we're celebrated, I think, will be very different.
Welcome to Black Philanthropy, Our Stories, where each episode spotlights awesome Black and African American leaders committed to transforming lives and communities through philanthropy. These authentic conversations will inspire, challenge, and remind you you are not alone. Here's your host, award-winning writer, director, and founder of Samuel and Murray, Michelle Renee Jackson.
I am so grateful for Heather Infantry today, who is the CEO of The Giving Gap. Heather, we are so happy to have you. It's so wonderful. We've been having this conversation for a bit of time about having you on the podcast, and so much of the work that you do for Giving Gap and for Black organizations has been awesome. Can you say a little bit about who you are and what you're up to in the world of philanthropy?
I grew up in Toronto, Canada. My parents and family are from Jamaica, and so I spent my formative years in Toronto before making it stateside, where I went to university to be an aspiring actress. So I got my undergraduate degree in theater. And during my time, I actually got into the nonprofit sector through the arts. I was working in administration, doing box office sales and backstage production. And upon graduation, thinking about how I was going to enter the theater profession as a performer, I looked around. It was the 90s, living in Atlanta, and I didn't really see too many roles outside of the Once Upon the Time When We Were Colored narrative. And it wasn't something that I wanted to do, but I still wanted to maintain a connection, a foothold in the arts and culture community, because art has always been the way that I've examined my world, made sense of it, has really helped to shape and inform the individual that I am. So I still wanted to maintain a tie. And that's where I really leaned into arts administration, and in doing so, found my way into fundraising, which oddly enough is very performative in all the ways, and I have put every one of my theater skills to use in this profession.
What drew you to theater?
I just remember being painfully shy as a kid, and my first drama class was in seventh grade, and the just practice of imagining a character and embodying that character just lit me up and turned me on in a way that I wasn't turned on before. And I've been in love with the practice, the art form ever since. And anything artistic related, music, literature, has just spawned from that initial love of drama.
What is it for you, Heather, that feels performative about fundraising?
When I say performative, I don't necessarily mean in a negative way. I'm speaking more specifically to the fact that so much of fundraising is about connecting to people and finding curiosity in one's story and journey. And so as someone who's had to work with, so-called major donors, that was one of the ways in which I could really tap into the motivations and values of the individuals that I was encountering, and being able to come to them with a set of queries and curiosities that really went beyond what can oftentimes feel very transactional to something that's very more human-centered. And then, of course, there's the part of it where you're standing in front of a room and you're trying to impart a message and you want to be captivating and engaging. All of that has tied and pulled on the teachings and learnings that I gathered when I was in undergrad.
How many years were you in fundraising, Heather?
I would say I started in 2001. I got my first sort of official nonprofit gig as an executive director working with an after-school choral music program in DC. And I often note that was my baptism by fire experience, because fundraising was a critical part of that position.
I recently was doing a Google search about philanthropy, and found that one of the most common questions about philanthropy is, what is philanthropy? People don't know what philanthropy is, which is interesting. And a lot of people are asking about what philanthropy is. And so as someone who's been in the space for philanthropy for 30 years, for you, what is philanthropy?
I love that question, and it's something that I've grappled with over the years, because there is philanthropy in terms of how it's executed. There is the philanthropy and how you would like philanthropy to be. But I'll say, for me, in my roles as a fundraiser, there was a particular moment during my professional trajectory where I was having a successful fundraising year and nearing the end of the fiscal year, and forecasting that we were going to be in the black, which is, for any organization is a really big deal. And we were actually forecasting that we would do this ahead of schedule, which was unheard of at the time that I was in this organization. And then I got the call, right? The call that we all dread and hate to get, but I got the call from a funder that had been supporting the organization for a number of years, giving us the heads up that in the following year, they would be withdrawing their support because their funding priorities had changed. And when I asked what we did to result in this happening, they said, no, it was nothing that you did. It's just that we're shifting priorities and we have limited resources. And it was really a difficult conversation, because I had to go back to my team and figure out, how do I kind of encourage them to keep going? How do I find ways to keep myself going when I'm working really, really hard? And I'm showing that the work that I'm doing is really, really good, but it's still not producing the result that we need at the end of the day. And that's when I sort of happened upon what has become a foundational philosophy of fundraising for me, which is about opportunity finding. That what we do as fundraisers, more than anything, is we connect people's values to their financial investments. And that is a lot more than just donations. And that within the nonprofit space, there is a lot more that we offer than the facilitation of their investments into a mission. I watched as friendships were being formed outside of the organization for which the organization was responsible for connecting, and how those became very enriching to the folks that were involved in our organization, but how the organization had become central to those relationships. The ways in which we were supporting folks advancing in their career or finding love or developing a skill, all these things that are an extension of contributing to a mission, I was seeing as this mutually beneficial opportunity matchmaking thing that I was central to. And the minute I shifted to that is the moment, and then started to sort of, construct a whole philosophy toolkit around like how we would operationalize that kind of thinking. That's when the world opened up for me. And we were beginning to find opportunities beyond our wildest imaginations, because we now focused on tending to relationships, not in service to the bottom line, but in service of how do we extend opportunities and avail ourselves to receive opportunities. And things would come to us in the most unlikely of ways. I remember a board member whose sibling owned a restaurant and was celebrating their 5-year anniversary. And because of the relationship that we had nurtured and fostered, both between that board member and her sibling, when it came time to think about doing something for community and raising dollars, we were first on their list to contribute their proceeds to. There were conversations with colleagues who on LinkedIn had updated their status because of changes in position, and I used that to extend an opportunity to have lunch and catch up. And at the conclusion of lunch, we are putting the plans together for some collaborative program. All because of an inclination towards curiosity, interest, and being very relational, and that made the work incredibly enjoyable and gave an opportunity for everybody within the organization to contribute in a way that sometimes philanthropy or the way that we traditionally do fundraising with an organization doesn't always allow.
What is the role of love, you think, these days in philanthropy? Or do you think that there is a role for love in philanthropy?
I think love is central to the practice of generosity and giving. I think at times the way philanthropy is organized or set up, it doesn't allow space for that. It's very interesting to me that in a field that is about connection and community, that oftentimes we feel very depleted, exhausted, we feel battered and bruised for desiring to want to support and invest in community. And clearly there's something amiss that needs correction. And that's some work that we're trying to do at Giving Gap.
What is Black philanthropy for you?
It's interesting. Black philanthropy, I think for me, in the early stages of my career, I would have probably characterized as a Black version of this sort of default reality of philanthropy, that it's just merely doing what we've always done from the traditional white-centered default kind of way of doing philanthropy, but instead we're doing it with the Black donors in service to Black organizations within Black community. And I think for me, that definition has definitely evolved, just given how the landscape has shifted and changed, and the ways in which so many folks are working diligently to surface all the ways in which giving practices and generosity has shown up specifically within our community from a cultural standpoint. I think about like the Souls of Philanthropy exhibit that's been making its rounds across the country, and the ways that they are highlighting folks in our community and the ways in which they give and why they give, not just a Black face, but there's a very specific cultural, like a clearly cultural distinction in the ways in which we show up in service to community that is much more than just a Black version of a white reality.
So then what does that evolution look like between what you used to think Black philanthropy is and what you think like it is now?
For me, it's really leaning into who we are in this space, who we are, who we've been, and not having these outside definitions be the default, or the only options of which we can show up for each other, and kind of dismantling or separating ourselves from the terminology that can oftentimes be distancing between us and the communities that we're trying to serve, but really just leaning in. It's, for me, in a lot of ways, it's a reclamation of what has always been, what has always existed, and in some ways, just moving away from the labeling of it, just doing the thing rather than constantly having to define the thing.
One of the things that you and I share in common is the men that we've had in our lives, both who've passed away. On my behalf, it's my father, Solomon Neal Jackson III, who in the very first episode that we had, I dedicated that episode to him, predominantly because I misunderstood, I think, of what philanthropy was. I think, and you might have a similar perspective of both coming as fundraisers to this space, both artists that come to this space, both, I would say, at times begrudged on my behalf, I'll speak for myself, fundraisers, like I have to fundraise in order to keep this, either the lifestyle of being an artist going or just to help fund my projects. But I thought very much of philanthropy, because my introduction to capital P philanthropy was through Plan Giving, through big institutional funding, big major donors, that was a very specific way of what philanthropy looked like. And so men like my father, who would see a family in San Diego walking into the bushes off the freeway and then would pull over and then invite them to live with him, which they did. And that was just the way that my father was just a man that opened up his heart, opened up his home, opened up his kitchen. He was known for his cooking, that was his way of loving. And that the idea that philanthropy excludes men like him or examples like him because he's not writing these huge checks is something that I have, in particular in doing this podcast, have had to reassess. Can you share a little bit about the roles of philanthropy that you've seen in your own family or your own life that has helped inform what philanthropy, not just Black philanthropy, but ultimately what, and I say not just Black philanthropy because I think ultimately what you've said is that it is philanthropy. It's not something different. Like what we've been doing for a bit of time is ultimately what philanthropy is.
In the op-ed that I posted to LinkedIn, I go on and on talking about my grandfather, Artley Charles Roach, who was a farmer from Jamaica, who at some point made his way to Canada and sponsored many of his siblings and family members to join him. And that's where I grew up. And without even realizing it till much, much later, and well past the time that he was here, that I realized that he, in fact, was the blueprint for what it means to give and be considerate and mindful of community, both family as community, but just the broader, wider community. My grandfather never married my grandmother, who he had 4 kids with. So he was a bachelor his entire life. Great in the kitchen, took those farming skills, turned every backyard that he ever had into an abundance of vegetables and fruits, which were on his table. He was really great with money. During the holiday season, he would summon me down to his house to write checks or to fill barrels with items that were going to cousins and family members in Jamaica. He was the patriarch of our family. He gave his abundance from the garden to neighbors and friends. Later on in life, as he was getting older, joined a church community and tithed. And even in his death, he was, made great pains to ensure that things were in place. His grave site was paid for, a will was in place, and the proceeds from the sale of his homes went on to support his children and his grandkids. And this was a man who didn't have any formal education, who worked as a train porter, retired from the Canadian National Rail as a train porter, but managed in his life to have such a meaningful impact on his family members, his neighborhood, during his lifetime and beyond his time here.
You wrote an op-ed about the power of home, and can you share a little bit more about why that was so important for you to write that op-ed?
The power of home is a new strategic direction that we are taking with Giving Gap. It comes right as we celebrated our 5-year anniversary as an organization. We were founded in 2020 at the height of everything that was going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've learned a lot in the 5 years that we've been here. And we've seen the landscape around DEI shift and change considerably since that time. And we have been doing a lot of internal reflection. I've been doing a lot of internal reflection as someone who's been in the nonprofit ecosystem for 3 decades. I've had so many experiences, good ones and not so great ones. And as we continue to have these conversations about what it means to be a Black nonprofit leader, a Black donor, to just be in this space as ourselves, constantly trying to navigate the terrain, the funding gaps and that sort of thing, and realizing that there are no steps being made, progressive steps being made that's pushing us forward any further along than we've been. At some point, we've got to take inventory and figure out what is the way that we are going to sustain and support the work that we are all compelled and called to do. And essentially, Power of Home started as that kind of question for me and exploration. And my grandfather has spoken about as, again, that blueprint and model of what generosity and giving can be, has been available to me as a model and an example. But for whatever reason, I didn't always see it, because I think so often the news cycle and the headlines tend to uplift and amplify those that have big dollars behind their name, and not necessarily those of us that have greater proximity to community doing the work. And so that was kind of the genesis of Power of Home, was asking myself internally, how can I do work that's centered around giving and generosity that doesn't make me feel bad all the time, that has me showing up to work with a sense of dread in my stomach? How do I relieve myself of that and therefore relieve the rest of my peers and colleagues in that space? And home suddenly appeared. It made sense, thinking about my grandfather and thinking about home being the origin place where relationships are formed and care is given, and is the obvious place from which we all spring from. That idea kind of morphed into what is a new direction for us as an organization.
So Heather, if you are moving in a new direction for Giving Gap, where were you previously, or where was Giving Gap previously?
I would say Giving Gap, like any other platform, operated from a place that was solely focused on the donor, right? That we were trying to solve a problem for a donor rather than trying to solve a problem for the community. So many of the platforms exist to create a frictionless environment in which donors can easily find organizations and contribute money. And that's valuable, but the ecosystem requires so much more than accommodations for donors to give resources. Like, we all have a duty and an obligation to show up for each other and to meet each other where we are. And by solely focusing on donors, we've kind of missed the needs of nonprofit organizations. And we've created these rigid divisions between like all of us who play in this space. I think when we talk about how traditional philanthropy has constructed a system that keeps folks in their place, it's a huge disservice to how we interact with each other. there's a great comment that I heard from Tyrone Freeman, who wrote the biography of Madam C.J. Walker, where he talks a lot about her philanthropy. And he says that one of the things that she's noted as saying is that for every gift she gave, it was a gift that she needed. This notion, particularly in our community, that we just sit up here as donor and then the other person sits over here as, handout nonprofit leader or just beneficiary, is a complete fallacy, right? If we think about our own lives, there have been times where people contributed to us, and at times in which we have contributed, there are also moments where we have been the community organizer, erecting an initiative or starting an organization. Like, these are roles that are fluid and interchangeable across the span of a lifetime. And when we narrowly define someone by a transaction, then we miss out on the entire ecosystem, which is relational and human-centered. And so much of what we lost or we overlooked when we were erecting this platform was the relational piece, which is not just about donor to nonprofit, but it's nonprofit to donor to beneficiary and back again. And it's a web that just goes back and forth. And so with our new strategy, we're doing away with those terms and trying to surface terminology that really speaks to the relationship piece of all of it.
Doing away with what terms, Heather?
Terms like donor, funder, nonprofit leader, and then other terms like capacity building, at risk, disenfranchised, marginal, underfunded, under-resourced, all those terms that do nothing but have us internalize a sense of incompetence while trying to navigate the funding terrain and exempt foundations and funders and the like to not be accountable to community in ways that they should.
What are the replacements for those words for donor, for funder?
Partner, friend, supporter, neighbor. Lover, colleague.
For those who are not already familiar with Giving Gap, what does Giving Gap do?
Our mission at Giving Gap is to advance racial equity and charitable giving. And up until this point, we've been doing that through three distinct ways, primarily through an online platform at givinggap.org, where you can find and support 2,000 plus organizations that we've cataloged on the website thus far. You can search for those organizations by cause area, by geography, and learn a little bit about them, and then connect to them directly to make a contribution if you are so inspired. Secondly, we've been collecting data about these various organizations, and in 2024, we published our first ever State of Black Nonprofits report. Less about talking about the gap in funding, which we're all too aware about, but more so to amplify the unique, I would say, strengths and characteristics that are specific to Black nonprofit leadership and the ways in which they show up into the space and produce results that I would deem as high performing. The fact that they bring lived experience to the sector, the fact that predominantly a number of organizations are headed by women, and there's so much written about the effectiveness of women-led leadership, their ability to do more with less, like all of these different factors that at times have disqualified organizations from being able to participate in funding are really the attributes that make for successful leadership. So we really wanted the State of Black Nonprofits report to be a love letter to our community. And then lastly, we take that platform, those data points, and we mount various campaigns and events to bring awareness to the work that's being done and to mobilize resources to support their missions.
You are transitioning from what's been done traditionally to then this sort of new space of relationship focus, where it's not just everyone's thinking about what the donor wants and how can we make the donor happy, but ultimately, how can we make this a relationship where all parties are receiving? What does that look like now for Giving Gap? in the work that you're doing when it's less donor centric and more relationship building?
So there are 4 parts to it. First is remembering. So remembering is really about like what we just did, talking about reflecting on my grandfather, reflecting on your father. These folks within our lineage that have had an indelible mark, have exemplified giving and generosity in a way that oftentimes isn't celebrated or acknowledged. And asking all of us to recall those folks in our history, in our network, in our community, in our families, like recall the names of those folks, the things that they did, how we felt about what we did, and continuing to talk about those folks, and it allowing that to spark other names that come forward. And in that process, just thinking about what are the models and examples that they left for us that we can reclaim if we haven't claimed them, that we can reclaim back into our approach in doing this work. Because the models are there, they've been there, right? We are growing in terms of a niche part of the nonprofit sector. Every day, new organizations are being erected. There's so much wisdom there. And so the act of remembering is a way for us to connect back to that and also sort of divorce ourselves from the notion that the only person that can be generous are the Gates and the Melinda Frenches of the world or the Mackenzie Scotts. The second part of Power of Home is language, as I referred to earlier, that the language that we're using, the terms that we're using are inefficient. They create barriers and divisions where there shouldn't be any. They create a feeling of tension and animosity. They leave us depleted and feeling low in terms of our self-worth. And so we want language that's affirming. So for Giving Gap as part of the strategy, that involves creating a glossary of terms, one that really points out the kind of anti-Blackness that is consistent and common within institutional philanthropy, and then a glossary that is much more affirming and speaks to the human-centered relational part of what we're trying to do with the Power of Home. The third is community wisdom, which is also an extension of the remembering piece, right? So as I mentioned, we've been in the trenches doing this work for generations. We know a lot. We know how to lead while Black in the most turbulent of times. Like that wisdom is there. And so over the past year and a half, we've been interviewing various leaders of numerous organizations and gleaning those insights. And what we hope to do in the coming months is put together a publication that addresses some of the themes that emerge from those insights that we've gathered to offer back to the community a living library of resource and wisdom and best practices. And then the last piece of this is reinterpreting the data. It's the truth-telling component of Power of Home. So much has been written about the funding gap, specifically the ways in which philanthropy has excluded or redlined, specifically our organizations, and yet nothing has changed with regards to the plight of our work in this sector. And a lot of it has to do with the way that the problem is being framed, that in a lot of ways, when we are talking about the gap in funding, we are not interrogating philanthropy's enduring allegiance to whiteness. We merely talk about this gap as if it's an unfortunate circumstance, as a result of the failings of these organizations, and if you are so compelled to give money. But a deeper probing question would ask, what does it mean to be part of a system that rewards those who have proximity to wealth versus proximity to community? What does it mean if all the resources go to white leadership, but yet problems persist? Does that not make it race-based grant making that everybody, wants to put their hands up and not be part of? And these are oftentimes the questions that are not being asked with these reports. And so Giving Gap wants to look back and take a different kind of lens and ask more probing questions that get at the heart of the matter, and less about trying to interrogate this for the benefit of philanthropy with some expectation that they will do something different than they've done, but more so for us to really see with eyes wide open the ways in which the system just is not designed to support or invest in us, and that it behooves us to focus on ourselves and to do what for generations folks have done, which is rely on their own wisdom and their own sense of history and remembrance to make the impact in their community that they so desire to make.
Sometimes it feels like what we're doing as Black people, as Black communities, is being excluded from this sort of larger institutional thing. And I think, but we're also still a part of that. And I don't know. One of the things that you said in your op-ed was this sense of, I'm going to read it, is a declaration of independence from a system that was never built for us to succeed. And I wonder what that independence looks like for us to declare that as Black people or Black communities who are seeking funding. And ultimately, from which system are we declaring our independence from?
For me, what has been really extraordinary about this process in coming to home has been what it has allowed me to see that I wasn't seeing. And for Giving Gap, we have the benefit and the privilege of exclusively leaning into our community. And what that allows me to do at the helm is to really lean into like the culture of who we are. And one of the things that I saw after seeing my grandfather in a new way, 19 years since he's passed, and having worked in this sector for, like I said, almost 30 years. But one of the things that revealed to me came up when I was at the Community Investment Network, which is a network of Black giving circles across the country. They held a leadership summit last October in Philadelphia. And during one of our group sessions, a woman who's never had kids, who's married, but was speaking up about her concern for the babies in her community. And what are we going to do about the young people in my community? And immediately I saw her as the auntie figure, which is a very specific archetype in our community that is never talked about in the ways in which like other types of donors are talked about. But the auntie, when you think about it, I have a sister who's auntie to my two girls. She herself doesn't have kids, but the way that she has been a support for my children, the ways in which she has been like a go-to for them, the investments that she's made in their education, the times that she's shown up to the recitals and the track meets, and all the ways in which aunties play a very essential role in the lives of young people and have been so incredibly important to supporting a nuclear family that is stressed, trying to like raise kids. All of a sudden, like, I can see that in a way that I never saw before. And that is, for us, the auntie, you don't even have to explain it, right? There's like auntie is the shorthand for an individual who does all kinds of things for a family. And is very concerned about her nieces and nephews, and by extension, the nieces and nephews that are in her community that are not always by blood. And so that has been like the revelation for me. And I think the more that we lean into who we are, the more I think we'll be able to see the obvious answers to the problems that we've been banging our head against all the time. Because the issue for us has never been one of hard work. It's never been about hard work. We do hard things. Hard is in our DNA. What has been so depleting and fatiguing and exhausting about playing in this space has been the illusion that there's opportunity for us if we follow these steps. If we go down this path, if we do this thing, we fill out this grant report, we come to this event, we network, we get that board member, we do all these things, but then we come up short. And we're told it's because, well, we're not in alignment, or we didn't fit this and it didn't fit that. And then we internalize that as some failing of our making, when really at the end of the day, it's just a system that's not constructed or designed to benefit the majority of us, even though one or two might find success. But that just creates an opportunity for big P philanthropy to hold it up as some exception that they can then point to and say, well, they've done it, why can't you? And we judge the accessibility of a thing by the majority of people being able to win, not the select few. But the way philanthropy plays, or the way that philanthropy has constructed itself, it can make it feel as though that's not the case. I have an example happening right now in Atlanta that I think speaks so eloquently to this situation. In Atlanta, the High Museum of Art, which is one of our biggest cultural institutions in the region, recently reported that they had a senior level executive appropriate $600,000 from the institution over the span of 4 years. And that person has since resigned, and the institution has retained an attorney and is referring the case for federal investigation. That's interesting, but I think what's more telling about the situation and about the relationship institutions like this have within the community is that they reported that they are not anticipating any sort of financial hardship as a result of it, that financially they're stable and that they're not having to make any cut to operations, which is mind-boggling. $600,000 speaks to how over-resourced this institution is, that if losing that amount of money doesn't have any kind of bearing on your ability to deliver programs, then if I'm a donor or a contributor to this organization, I've got to ask, how is my money being spent? And what I know, because this same institution, under the Woodruff Art Center umbrella, probably about 10 years ago, had another employee in another division of the organization embezzle $1.1 million. And that organization went on to mount $100 million campaign that they exceeded by $10 million. They never lost donor confidence. They never lost donor favor. And not because clearly they've got good governance or oversight, because now we're looking at 2 occasions in which that was not the case. But we know if $10,000 went missing in our organization, that would be the end of any opportunity that we would have to be able to raise money. So it's never been about the efficacy of leadership or our counterparts having better solutions. It's all been about a system that was designed to support their winning even when they fail at doing their job. They still get to win. And so, we've got to acknowledge that, right? We've got to acknowledge that and determine whether it makes sense for us to continue beating our heads up against a wall, to play in the sandbox with folks that, aren't coming to this work with the same level of authenticity and integrity in which we show up ourselves.
As a fundraiser, someone who's been trained like you as a traditional fundraiser, what is the alternative? Before I finish that question, I wanted to say, I think about this number of the 3%, how much of the funds that are allocated each year through philanthropy go to Black communities. And my thought, ultimately, it's a funder and a fundraiser issue. If we want to see the number of funds being allocated to Black communities, then because I'm a fundraiser, my mind thinks, well, then we need to fundraise more. We need to be able to train people to fundraise more. We need to be able to train people to be able to understand sort of the fundamental principles of fundraising at a high level, at a major giving level, or whatever those sorts of principles are that you and I both know, so that more communities know how to do this work, how to get those funds. That seems to not actually have a ceiling on it. But it sounds like part of what you're saying is, no, that's not the answer, is just fundraise more, because it's not a fundraising issue. It's a fill in the blank issue. And if it's a fill in the blank issue, what is the fill in the blank issue, you think?
I mean, I'm not saying it's not a fundraising issue, but for a lot of us, it's a fill in the blank issue. And I think for us, what it's asking us to do, which maybe many of us haven't done, is erect some new models for how we support and sustain the work. Now it becomes a market constraint. It's not even now it becomes, it's always been a constraint of doing this kind of work, right? So if you're a new and emerging nonprofit leader wanting to address a need in your community, and you know that funding options are limited or scarce or far and few between as it relates to traditional philanthropy, how might you think about constructing the work differently? Because what happens is the whole nonprofit ecosystem has trained us to think in a very limited kind of way about how we can serve and support community. But the act of remembering, hopefully will bring to mind the ways in which this work was always done. And it's also philanthropy that has insisted that we do it within the confines of this 501c3 structure. And that may be what's holding us back from being able to do the things that we need to do. I don't know what the answers are. Right now, what I've done is identified a problem that many of us have identified. And for me, the first act has been to fundamentally shift our thinking. And my hope is that shifting the consciousness of how we enter in this work will then reveal to us how we can do the work on our terms in a way that makes us feel good. Not eliminates the hardness of it, because to serve is a difficult thing, but to bring back the joy that should also accompany the hard work that's involved. There's so many of us that are operating in this space with no joy. And how can that be when so many of us, when we did our State of Black Nonprofits report and we asked the question, why do you do this? An overwhelming majority of folks pointed to a compulsion, a sense of duty, a calling from something higher and above. How can something that is spiritual, that is guided by spirit, have you feeling so terrible about yourself and about your circumstance and your community? Something there is amiss. There is something that is wrong that needs to be shifted. We have to make the work feel good so that we can keep doing it, because the community needs us. We need each other, and we can't continue to do it from this place of exhaustion. Doing things in service to each other, for each other, in relationship with one another cannot leave us depleted. That is life-affirming work, but yet this is how we feel when we do it. Something is broken and wrong. And it's not what we're doing. I think it's the way in which we think about what we're doing, or the way that we've been trained to think about what we're doing.
As a fundraiser, as a Black filmmaker who fundraises on behalf of enslaved narratives, is very painful. It's very painful to try to teach, to go to predominantly donors who are not of color, to go to them on a regular basis and to try to convince, which is its own problem. It's not my job to convince anybody to do anything, right, as a fundraiser, but to plead the case over and over again about investing in Black storytelling, investing in how we reframe, how we reimagine how slavery shows up on screen. It is painful, but I will also say it's also painful to do that with Black donors as well, who don't give. or Black, I should say, prospects. I think a recent no that I got was, this is not from a Black VC, was, this is not a good time for me to think about, changing my philanthropic priorities. And so I think maybe what I'm hoping is like, well, surely Heather has the answer, because on how we make this fun, how we make this more joyful. Many of our guests who've been on the show who are fundraisers, Stephen Wallace, Ken Miller, Art Taylor, Frankie Axum Frederick, these are predominantly individuals who really love this work, who love being fundraisers. I think that's its very specific skill set, a very specific calling that not all EDs are called to do, enjoying the process of fundraising. And so I think all that to say is that I understand the pain. I've spent many a days in this space in tears, just thinking, how am I going to pull this off? Knowing that the work is so valuable. But I think often what many of our colleagues would say, who are fundraisers, would say, because it's ultimately not about you, that when we begin to personalize it, to your own point, I think, when it becomes this question of making us feel badly about the work, that donors said no, that the funding shifted because we've shifted priorities. Well, it's hard when you are called to this work of whatever organization you're working for to not personalize it. And so anyway, I guess that's all a way to say is that, Heather, when you guys figure out the answer, we'll all be reading that article or reading that report.
We're going to be figuring that out together. It's a group project. It's a group project. We're all in it together. We all have the insights. It's all there for us. And the act and practice of remembering and changing the language and relying on community wisdom and speaking the truth about what is, I think will get us there. That's my hope.
Heather, is it your recommendation or Giving Gap's recommendation based on your understanding of what's happening on why Black communities are not receiving the funding that they are receiving? Is it your recommendation to do not seek out institutional funding at this point?
No, that's not necessarily my recommendation. I think if you're not having success with institutional funding, if you are getting the runaround and you've done all the things that you feel like you should do to be successful and you're still not finding success, I think this is an option for you. I think it's also an invitation for folks to think about other ways, other opportunities, because I think when we default or defer to the 501c3, for example, or the DAFT, or even the way that we think about like mobilizing resources and that sort of thing, we lose sight, again, like what I've been saying, like we just lose sight of what might be in front of us. And I just don't want us to continue defaulting to these institutions or these practices as the end all be all, because clearly they haven't been, right? The data supports that. Our own experiences affirm that. And we are in a climate that is unfavorable to any kind of conversation around equity, any kind of conversation around inclusion and diversity. And so we can continue to knock on the door, hoping to get a different result, but so many things affirm and support. And if we look at history, right, we're in a cycle that we've been in before, and we will be the favor again at some point, like we have been in the past. And will we meet that moment in the same way that we're meeting it now? Or will we, really reclaim what is ours and be a little bit more discerning about who we want to partner with in this space? Because it's a privilege. It's a privilege to work alongside us in this work. I've met so many phenomenal leaders that not only give of their brilliance in terms of ideas and the ways in which they commit, but they've put their bodies on the line. Like the exhaustion piece is very important and real to speak to over and over again, right? We've got leaders who are so committed that their own health is in question. And when you push them about that, they don't push back with "you're right" or "I need to take care." The pushback is, "So be it, because this is what I've been called to do. This is what is demanded and required of me as a person in this community." To partner with someone like that, to partner with leaders who show up in that kind of capacity, regardless if the donor or the funder or the climate is good for them or not, that's the person you want to bet your investment on. That's who it is. And part of the sort of philosophical shift and consciousness shift is actually, acknowledging our own self-worth in this space, because nobody can match our level of commitment and creativity and innovation and our insistence on supporting community. Nobody can match that. And that kind of internalized sense of worth, when it actually is internalized, will be a dramatic shift for all of us. Like I just know that the work will look different. It will feel different. It won't be any less hard, but how we feel about it and how we're celebrated, I think, will be very different.
Karen Isbell is our last episode that just aired recently. Part of what Karen talks about as the VP of advancement at Kalamazoo College is the safety risks for fundraisers and for EDs, that ultimately what capital P philanthropy has created is this vulnerability between the fundraiser and the funder that puts predominantly women at risk for being backed into literal corners on behalf of, we need to do whatever you have to do for this institution to get that gift. And so capital P philanthropy ultimately has us who are asking in a position of, some people will say, I would never be a fundraiser. I don't want to beg for money, right? But there's this idea, none of us are not begging, we're asking, we're inviting, we're partnering. But this idea that we are begging, groveling, that an institution right now, many of our largest institutions right now are in a position of, are we going to lose that 7-figure gift? Or are we just going to do what that donor wants us to do? So this sort of constant money giving charity gives people, the giver, the ability to keep someone backed against a wall in order to pay their light bill, pay their personnel, build their buildings, whatever it is. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is that we don't have to be on our literal knees in this process as fundraisers, as EDs, as people who are in the position of receiving those funds and trying to acquire and facilitate those funds. That it sounds like much of what you're saying is that the asking still has to happen. I don't know how the asking doesn't not happen, but that you can be on your feet in that process, that you can be someone at the table in that process, not someone who's just waiting for people who are at the table to write you a check. To me, that's what it sounds like you're saying, Heather, that there's a shift in, and that so many of us in the fundraising space or ED space or nonprofit space, who's the asking space, have accepted that role as, oh, I'm just so grateful. Thank you for this money. You're just so wonderful. It's like, well, no, we're partners.
Yes, it's a partnership. It's an equitable partnership. And too many times, we are told to be grateful, even when the contributions are insufficient, right, for what we need to do, or the terms of the agreement don't accommodate for how we need to do our work. And it's fascinating because philanthropy has all the authority and the resources. And we saw during the pandemic how quickly resources can move once a decision has been made to move resources. Folks were getting contributions through Zelle and Cash App. All of a sudden, the mechanism by which we were giving money was very loose. It was very loose and creative. And so the case study is there that once a decision to give to a certain community of people is made, the logistics of how you do that is very simple. But the challenge has always been around the belief, the value, and then, decisions that spring forth from that. So to me, what happened during the pandemic is just another data point, not for them, but for us. It's another data point for us to acknowledge, oh, you can give money, and that it's never been about merit, and that I'm not asking to receive this funny money because of race, or the fact like you are a race-based funder. You've been giving to white organizations, your whole portfolio is white. That's race-based funding. But you flip it around and talk about the merit of the organization when at the end of the day, it's really more so their proximity to you from a race and socioeconomic status sort of thing. And, it's us seeing that for what it is and then deciding, well, what are you going to do with that? Right? Now you've got the data points. You know what the landscape is. These are the constraints that impact your ability to do this work. Now you've got to create something meaningful, sustainable within those constraints. That's all it is. It's a math problem. It's a logistics problem, like whatever it is. It's not about, if you're going to play with, philanthropy, I'm saying, like, if you're going to play in that space, that's what you're contending with. That's the capital T truth that we have to contend with, that the rules are different for us, that these are the constraints that we're up against. And if we're up for the challenge, well, then, God bless you. But if you're looking for something else, if you want to go another way, then I would rely on our own remembrance and our own wisdom to chart a new way forward.
One that's not based on tax liability reduction, essentially, right?
That part.
Essentially, right? One that's based on love. Heather, we've talked a lot about institutional funding, the role it plays, the role it doesn't play, I should say, the lack thereof of the role sometimes in Black communities. And I just wondered where you thought the role of Black funders plays in all of that. I know that you're connected to ABFI, myself as well, and all of the awesome work so many ABFI leaders are doing in institutions. And I wondered where they all fall in this, where Black funders, I should say, at institutions fall in this space of Black communities just not having all the funds that they need in order to thrive.
I'm very sensitive to those of us who find ourselves working in predominantly like white philanthropic institutions who have a heart for our community, but may not always be able to navigate that terrain without being able to talk about race in any kind of like transparent or authentic way because of any potential backlash that they might receive for doing that, or some perception that they're showing an allegiance that they feel like they can't show, even though their colleagues and peers will likely do the same thing. So I've often said that it's important for those of us who find ourselves in those spaces to have like an inside outside kind of strategy partnership. And that in many ways, I don't know that our job in those spaces is to transform philanthropy, but I do think there's a role that we can play in exposing some of the bad actors that operate in this space and some of the things that happen behind closed doors. I've had a number of colleagues who work for such institutions that are constantly trying to course correct for colleagues and directors that they report to that are making decisions or saying things that are very anti-Black or anti-community. And we are busily working behind them, trying to clean it up, trying to make it better than what it is. And I don't think that that's our job in that space. I think, as I said earlier, is to expose that. And there's a lot of exposing that needs to be done. For those that are running Black-founded, Black-led institutions, I think a lot of those folks are doing the best that they can, but are, operating with few resources and being able to meet the enormous need. And so I think it's a challenge to be, one of a few in that space trying to carry that mantle for everybody. So the power of home strategy, I think, also, begs of those on that so-called side of giving to also think about, like, what are the multipliers that we can apply to how we think about the work? Do we get into startup investment and figure out how to increase our revenue streams? I've been speaking to a gentleman that's looking at cash within our organizations, right? And that many of us have cash sitting in banks that are not accruing any kind of interest. And that just moving a balance into an interest bearing account or a high yield savings account could have somewhat of an effect on one's bottom line. But there are tools that exist that we're not taking advantage of because of our predominance and focus on philanthropy with a capital P and being in that kind of relationship with them. So I think across the board, right? On the funder side, on the nonprofit side, on the beneficiary side, like, all of us could benefit from just a different way of thinking about the work, right? An insistence that when I do this work, I've got to feel good about what I'm doing. And that's different from, like, the work being hard, but that feeling, because you know what it is to do hard work, but to be in the flow of it, that is still, like, motivating, inspiring, and a level of productivity that, you're eager to celebrate and tell everyone that you did. It's that other piece that we're trying to divorce ourselves away from.
Heather, now that you've been in the sector of philanthropy for 30 years now, I wondered if you thought about the legacy that you want to have or that you do have in this space.
It's so funny because my oldest, I've got two girls. One is 23 and the other is 19. My oldest graduated last year from Toronto Metropolitan University and is back in Atlanta. And oddly enough, she is in the fundraising space working for an independent school here. And we've had so many conversations just about her experience. But, she came up through it honestly. Like, she was on my hip when I was going to donor meetings or participating in events. She got a front seat to that. So she's been entrenched in it for as long as she's been around. And the same thing with my youngest, who's studying film in New York right now. I think, the question of legacy is an interesting one, because I remember when my oldest learned about the colonies and the issues that the colonists had with England and the whole Boston Tea Party. And her response to that was, well, couldn't they just fundraise for what they needed? And I thought, oh yeah, you are knee deep in this. She is my child. But beyond just my own children and their sense of giving and giving practices, I think for me, the legacy, I feel like I'm in the midst of legacy work. Like, I feel I've been doing this for so long and I've been looking for what that contribution can be. And for me, that sort of philosophical shift around opportunity finding, right? That we as fundraisers are facilitating ways in which folks can marry their values to their financial investments. Like, that was one piece of it. But Power of Home right now is resonating. Yeah, will be the thing that I leave behind that dramatically shifts the work in a way that we've never seen before.
You think about your 30 years in the philanthropy. Is there a failure or a mistake that was especially informative for you that you found really valuable for you as you go through this journey moving forward?
Probably my most humiliating and painful experience was a job working with a white-led organization where I was very successful in fundraising for them, incredibly successful. And we were serving a largely Black population. And it wasn't until I was a couple of years in really trying to solve what I thought was just a math problem, right? I was just trying to solve for, like, ongoing sustainability. And it got me questioning certain things about the program. And that query revealed for me inequities that were within the organization that I didn't realize, didn't notice, didn't pay attention to. And when I brought that to the attention of leadership, thinking that it was just an oversight, the amount of pushback that I got exposed to me that, oh, no, this isn't an oversight at all. This is how business is being conducted, and I am complicit in this. And I was part of supporting a major capital campaign for a new building that's here in Atlanta. And to this day, I have never been to that building. It is the greatest symbol of shame and humiliation that I've ever felt in my career. So that experience taught me, how easy it is for us to lose ourselves in this work. Listen, my last name is Infantry. I am the self-professed foot soldier for Black liberation. And I fell for the okie doke. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever recovered from that, quite honestly. And the instruction for me and to others is the level of hypervigilance you have got to have to protect what matters and what you value. And if it's us, that is an ongoing, because it's so easy to become seduced by things that take you away from what you profess to value.
What is your hope coming from these days?
My hope always comes from us. It always comes from us. When I reflect on the history and the fact that we are so visible, and that there isn't a story that you can tell any place in this country, and really any place across the globe, for which we are not part of it. Even if it's a troubling part of history, like, we are always enmeshed and entangled in every factor of society, right? There's not a genre of music that you can play that for which we don't have some part in. There's no aspect of society of which we were not invaluable in the manifestation of that thing, whatever it might be. And I think I find great solace in that. And even though our bodies oftentimes are devastated in ways that are unfair and unjust, what I know for sure is that generations beyond me will have to reckon, like generations before me had to reckon with, what are we going to do with us? And all the different names that we were given through generations, that's always been the question. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with them? What are we going to do with them? And I think that speaks to our resilience and our power, and that we're not going anywhere. And for me, that gives me hope and resolve and the inspiration to get up every day, really.
I think for many of us, we think this is not random, that our lives have purpose and meaning behind them. And that oftentimes there's this feeling, at least for myself, that as challenging as things are right now, and they are very challenging. If you want to turn on the news today, whichever day you're turning on the news today, it's going to be pretty wild, whatever you're watching. And that I am convinced that my life has meaning and purpose at this very moment, that I'm called to show up in a way that's specific to this time, and that I wasn't called to be born 100 years ago or even 100 years in the future. And I wondered for you, if you share that same sentiment, that your life isn't random, but that you actually might be here for a purpose, or that the timing that you're here is actually intentional. If that is the case, why do you think you're here at this moment right now in history?
I love that question. I think I'm here because of my insights and the way I can put disparate ideas together. I think I've often been tapped by colleagues professionally, by friends and family members socially, to to see things the way that they're not seen, and that the ways in which I see things are affirming and elevating and that sort of thing. And I think that's my life's work, and that's been my life's mission, and to connect those ideas and insights to people so that they can find greater meaning and greater appreciation for who they are and what they contribute. I also like Toni Morrison, and this has resonated with me from the time that I saw her say this, but she was interviewed by someone and asked the question, do you think that we asked to be born? And she said, I do think we asked to be born. And more than that, that requires that we do something meaningful with our lives, which in her opinion was to care for someone. And then to do less than that is poor for the soul. It's morally, I think she said it's morally demanding to do so, right? More intellectually interesting to care for someone, and to care for someone without knowing that that care is going to be reciprocated. That's the great risk in it all. But to do less than that is so uninteresting and so poor for the soul. And I love that. Like, so much of that philosophy and idea resonates with me, because at the end of our life, that will be the marker of whether we go into that passing peacefully with our spirit resolved, or whether we are wrestling with things. At the end of life, it will be the relationships that define whether it was a good one or not. Not the balance in the bank account, or the number of things that we have of a thing. It will be that we cared for someone and that someone cared for us.
One of the things that I'm grateful for about doing this podcast is I am really proud of it. I'm proud to do this work. I'm proud to create a space to share with the world. We have listeners all over the world. Awesome, amazing leaders like you and like our other guests as well. And I think for me, I am convinced that Black philanthropy, our stories, can be a catalyst for real transformation within capital P philanthropy. And because I do think that Black leaders have a unique perspective on the answer. Like you said today, you don't have the answer, but you're getting closer to the answer with a bunch of answers. And I just want to express gratitude for you for being a part of that. That ultimately, I just think Black people, Black leaders in philanthropy are the answer. That maybe no one's asking for, or that everybody's asking for. I think it's what I'm asking for. I think it's what people are desperate for. And I just appreciate your intention in being a part of that conversation of how do we get Black people what they need, and how do we get Black people to be reminded that we are what we need. We are the answer. Heather, is there anything else that you want to say before we scramble?
I just want to thank you for the time, the opportunity to be reflective, to remember for myself, to play around with terms, and just grateful to be part of this growing list of folks that you are in conversation with. And I champion you, I cheer you on. I know none of this is easy. You're wearing multiple hats, and I recognize the hard work that you put into this. But yet again, you are an example of folks in our community that are called and committed and do this work regardless of the challenges or barriers and obstacles that you face.
Amen to that. Heather, how can people stay in contact with you?
You can find me at givinggap.org, or reach me directly through LinkedIn or heather@givinggap.org.
Thanks for being an awesome colleague and partner in this work. To our listeners, we just express gratitude for you. We thank you for your time and for your caring about Black leaders in philanthropy. Once I was sharing with someone that we had this podcast about Black leaders in philanthropy, and he was not a Black leader in philanthropy, and he just thought, well, that's an interesting concept, but is there anything there? Yes, there's so much there. There's fucking awesome. It's awesome what we're doing.